This is The Physical Geography of the Sea, written by Lieutenant Matthew Fontain Maury. Now, as a quick aside, I call him Lieutenant because he was in the US Navy. And as an aside to my aside, I will just say that until comparatively recently, they said Lieutenant in the Royal Navy as well. I have a Sea Cadet manual from the 1940s where they say that it's pronounced Lieutenant in the Navy, and it's the Army and the RAF that say Lieutenant. This aside, we'll go back to this book. This was the first comprehensive work on oceanography published, and it was published in 1855, and this is my father's copy, which he got in 1945, and it fascinated him. Maury was a midshipman in the US Navy, and he had a carriage accident whilst ashore, which broke his leg, and he was no longer fit for active service at sea. So he went to work at what would in due course become the US Naval Observatory, and he eventually rose to be in charge of the same establishment. And when I say Maury did this and Maury did that, he had a team of people. He built up a team of people, and so some of the things I attribute to him are his team did it under his direction. So it's a bit like saying that Queen Victoria built Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She never laid a finger on a brick, I'll tell you. At some point in his career at the Naval Observatory, he wanted to put the study of sea into a scientific basis. So he made up a logbook and gave it to the captains of lots and lots of US ships, many of them whalers, and it would tell the ship's location, the date and time, the weather state, the sea state, any whether they sighted any whales or not, all kinds of information like that, and he tracked the sea. So one of the things that fascinated me further about this book is plate 10. And here is plate 10. Now we've all seen images like this on the TV, and it shows the track of a hurricane as it starts east of the Caribbean here, goes up, crosses Haiti, skirts Cuba, skirts Florida, Nebraska, and it weakens. It goes out into the Atlantic and weakens as it goes, and eventually it hits Britain and Ireland there. The reason this was fascinating is because this is the first time this was actually tracked. It's the first image anyone ever saw of how a hurricane starts and how its life progresses. The way that was done is you'll see here many little arrows, and each arrow is a report from a ship. The point of the arrow is where the ship was. The direction of the arrow is the direction of the wind during the report, and you will see numbers for the day of the month, the barometer reading, and little notes saying whether it was raining or whatnot, and the name of the ship. Various things like that. So with that information, he could see at what time it was bad weather and what time it was reasonable weather. He tracked where the bad weather went. He was fascinated by the fact it seems to follow the Gulf Stream, so he was wondering if the Gulf Stream had an influence on it. You will notice up here a whirlwind diagram. He called them whirlwinds. We now call them hurricanes. A whirlwind being a different thing altogether. Now the hurricane tracked here is from 1848, and when my father's father saw this, he told him a story. Now, I've got to make it clear who's being told the story, who's telling the story, and who was in the story. It was my father heard this story from his father, and it's about my father's grandfather. So it's about my great-grandfather. It won't help if I tell you their names, because all three of them are called Peter Leith. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. When my great-grandfather was an old man, sitting beside the fire, the herring fleet was in Stromness, and a middle-aged man made the 4-mile walk from Stromness to see him. And this man had been a young boy of 14 in 1848, and him and my great-grandfather had both been on a herring fishing boat out of Wick. It had been a pleasant morning, a reasonable morning, and 800 boats or so had set sail from Wick in the morning. But a gale got up and the conditions worsened rapidly, and it became very bad indeed. Now, the boats that were later out, that weren't far from the harbour, turned round and managed to get back. But the ones that were further away, by the time they got back, the tide was going out and the sea state had worsened. And trying to get back to the harbour, many of them were wrecked on the rocks alongside the harbour. But the ships that were even further out, they had no chance at all and had to just ride out the storm. And the boat that my great-grandfather and this man were on, sorry, I don't know the other man's name, that wasn't part of the story, I was told. They rode out the storm for a while, and at one point, my great-grandfather lashed this 14-year-old boy to the mast to stop him from going overboard. So they rode out the storm, and as the storm was dying down, they saw the Old Man of Wick, which is a part jutting out into near Wick, just a castle on it and such like, and they knew where they were, and things were getting better. So my great-grandfather, was told to break out the whisky bottle, because whilst at sea, he had control of the whisky bottle because he himself didn't drink. The story does not say whether or not he actually had a drink that day. It must have been a harrowing time indeed. By the time the storm was over 37 boats had been wrecked, and 94 fishermen lost their lives in Wick Harbour alone. And there was more loss of life further up the coast and as far as Orkney. So that day is now called Black Saturday, and if you visit the Wick Society in Wick, there is a display about them, about this tragic time. I shall leave a link to their website in the description below. But the reason that this sparked off the telling of that story is that for a long time we thought that this was actually the same storm, but it turns out not to have been, because the storm came up on the 18th of August in Wick, but this hurricane was just starting east of the Caribbean on the 18th, so it can't have been that one. So that is a tragic tale from Wick. This data, however, still exists. It is held at the Library of Congress in America, and someone has digitised all that information, and you can actually ask to see it, and you can get a copy of the data to do analysis that you want on it. Some bright spark took that data, stripped it of everything but the location data, and then plotted it on a blank rectangle, and you got this. You can see the ghosts of where the continents are, because obviously no ships sailed across the continent. And then all these black lines are where the ships sailed. These are the tracks of all the ships. There are many hundreds of them. And there's a number of interesting things you can see just by glancing at this here. These lines here, or these grey areas here, are the doldrums, where you can get into them and the wind dies, often for weeks, and there's at least one account of a ship being stuck there for a month. But as the seasons change, the doldrums change from place to place, or the current you're on will drift you outside them and you'll catch some wind, and off you go again. It must be boring as heck though. This other black patch down here are the San Fernandez Islands. The reason for this black mark on the chart is that at sea, your latitude, your north-south position, is easy to find with a sextant and an almanac. But for accurate longitude, your east-west position, you need an accurate chronometer. So if a ship has rounded Cape Horn, the chances are it has been rough weather and that your chronometer might have been put off by the rough treatment. So since you know the latitude of the San Fernandez Islands, you sail up to that latitude and then you sail east and west until you find the San Fernandez Islands, and then you can either check that your chronometer is right or you can reset it if it's wrong. And then off you go, you sail around the Pacific and do your things you need to do in the Pacific. This thing also shows how you have to be careful with data and how you interpret it. I found one website who says of this shows how important the American shipping was to global trade, because you can see the thick lines here to the east coast of America, and they lead all across the world. But Maury only gave his logbooks to American ships, so this more or less shows where Maury's office was, which is about here. So be careful in your interpretation of data. Right, there we go. There is a very brief summary of my father's book here. Now, the one thing this highlights is why I think it's important to write down all the stories, all your family stories that you can. Because whilst this isn't a terribly important story in the scheme of things, the Wick Society were very happy to get that story to add to the Tales of Black Saturday. But had my grandfather not noticed that my father was looking at this book, he might have forgotten to tell it to him. So I would advise people to write down all the family stories they can think of, including ones from today. We all think of history as something that happened a long time ago, but history begins now. Write down what's going on now, because it will be somebody's history in the future. If you have enjoyed my little talk here, a like, a comment and or a subscribe would be very nice. In the meantime, have fun till then.